announcement for the students in college. We do have now a teaching fellow for the course. That's Peter Reed over here. And Peter will be getting in touch with you regarding weekly review sessions, office hours, and so forth. So look out for a message from Peter. With that, we're delighted to have for the first of our 3 sessions with Daron Nejamoğlu, who's graciously accepted to make it all the way from MIT, and despite Google Maps, and just to feed your tech antipathy these days. And today's topic is growth, and we're going to ask Daron to lead us off, and then we'll engage in discussion amongst ourselves and with all of you.
Okay, so I don't know how to put this on actually, given the I don't remember.
Your attire.
Yes, exactly, my attire. That wasn't quite. I put my jacket on and it's warm, because that's the only way I can put a microphone, I think. Okay, so then now you can hear me well? Perfect, great. It's very happy to be here to sort of exchange ideas with all of you, as well as with Danny and Roberto. So I guess this is the first lecture to lay the scene about economic growth, so that we can then talk about various issues that go beyond growth in terms of technology inequality, fairness law, and so on. So I want to sort of do that and lay the scene about what it is that we know about economic growth, both mostly from, almost entirely for the next 20 minutes, from a positive point of view. So I'm not going to worry about what economic growth means, whether it's good or not, and I'm not even going to talk about its inequality implications, because that's one of our other sessions. So I want to just sort of lay the scene in terms of why it is that economic growth is actually an important problem which remains unresolved, and what other topics about the world actually depend on that. And I think one place to start is by looking at not economic growth, but the inequality between nations in terms of prosperity as measured, say, by GDP per capita. Although this picture is very similar if instead of GDP per capita, you use other measures that correlate with it, such as life expectancy, poverty, consumption, even education. So, and the summary here is that there is just a mind-bogglingly large gaps between countries. We live in a hyper-connected, globalized world, but the countries that are in the dark, they're about the 10 richest countries in the world, 11 richest countries in the world, are about 65 times as rich as the countries in the lightest color, which are the poorest 12 countries in the world, on average. So that's really hard to fathom. People, in the United States worry about making ends meet. Imagine doing so with 1/65 of the income per capita of the average US household. So one question, there's a bunch of questions about, deep causes of this, implications of this, but the first thing I want to talk about is, how did this come about? So the first thing you can look at is, let me see if this works. It was working a second ago. Okay. Maximize this here. Oh no, that didn't maximize. So let's do one more time. Okay, one more time. No, from here. Click here one more time. Yeah. Okay. So if you look at the economic growth, which is more the focus, over the last 60 years, you'll see a number of interesting patterns. First of all, I'm just showing you a number of countries, although they're not picked with any kind of bias. They're sort of interesting countries, but if you pick the different set, you'll see some patterns that are generally similar. First of all, you'll see that in 1960 already, there are pretty large gaps. How large? I'll show you that in a second. more formally. But already, if you look at the gap between India and the United States or the United Kingdom, that's rather large in 1960. Since then, you'll see there's quite a lot of heterogeneity in economic growth. Some countries, like the United States and the United Kingdom, have grown relatively steadily. So this is in logs, so a straight line means a constant growth rate. So the US, UK experience, you can summarize with a constant growth rate. A bunch of other countries, such as Singapore, have converged to some of these richest countries. In fact, Singapore has now exceeded the UK and is on a par with the US. Others, like South Korea or Spain, have converged for a while and then have settled into sort of a level that's a little bit below, quite a bit below in some cases. But then you have all sorts of other experiences, like Brazil also starts converging just like Singapore and South Korea do here, but then it sort of stops and doesn't do much. So actually the gap between the United States and UK and Brazil is now larger than it was in the early 1980s, because these countries have continued to grow at something like 1.5% a year in per capita terms, and Brazil hasn't. Guatemala, even more so, it has followed the Brazilian example, but it sort of leveled off even sooner, so a gap between Guatemala and Brazil opens up as well. Then there are countries like Nigeria that don't even do that. There isn't much of a convergence in the Nigerian case, although if you go to Nigeria, you'll see a dynamic economy, but it's not enough for this large country to sort of increase its GDP per capita. And then, of course, there is China, which I'll talk more about, where starting from very low base, sometime around 1980, Chinese growth starts. It actually accelerates a little bit in the 1990s, and it sort of continues a little bit slower pace in the 2010s. So there's a lot of heterogeneity. So with this heterogeneity, you might think, well, the countries that are rich in that first map are typically those that have grown a lot recently, and that's true. But actually, there is also a lot of stability in the post-1960 or post-1950 period. So here, I'm showing you the GDP per capita per worker, doesn't make any difference, of each of these countries, but I'm doing that relative to the US so that the axes are comparable. And then I put the 45-degree line. You'll see that most of the countries are actually scattered around the 45-degree line, which means that the ranking of these countries in 1960 is pretty similar to what the ranking you have in terms of prosperity today. So whatever caused it, the big gaps haven't really opened up in the last 60 years. There's a lot of interesting stuff. The Singapore versus Nigeria or Singapore versus Brazil makes a big difference. But for the big picture, it's not really that. There are some, of course, exceptions. Venezuela here, it's the country that's really off the 45-degree line because it was relatively prosperous in 1960, and then it's gone down really badly. There's China and Korea here, Korea versus China here, that are quite off above the 45-degree line because they've done quite well. But by and large, the big income differences haven't opened up in the last 60 years. That doesn't mean that a country cannot grow very rapidly, as the Chinese, Singaporean, or South Korean example illustrates, but there's something that happened earlier. When did it happen? So a lot of the data that we have that's highest quality, especially in terms of making sure that we don't compare apples and oranges completely. So in particular, how do you compare countries that have different currencies, etc. So there's a lot of work that goes into making these things comparable. So there are data sets that enable you to do that, not perfectly, but reasonably well in the post-1960 period, so that prices are measured across different countries, making it comparable, what is called purchasing power parity comparisons. But if you go earlier, you can work with guesstimates, and the economic historian Angus Maddison is the one who is most famous for producing these guesstimates. So here, I'm showing you his data. But rather than specific countries, I'll show you the specific countries in a second. I followed him. He does this grouping: Western offshoots, US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, Western Europe, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. So you see in 1800, the gap between these countries is already there, these groups. Africa is a bit poorer according to Madison. Asia is a bit poorer, especially if you go back, actually, Asia is not doing that badly, and there is quite a bit of controversy about whether here Madison is too conservative or too negative on Asia. That's a big debate I don't need to get into, but these gaps are not huge. Then what you see is that this pattern of growth that I had shown you earlier for, say, US and the UK, actually starts perhaps a little more slowly, but it starts in the 19th century. So throughout the 1800s, Western offshoots are growing, Western Europe is growing. Look at Latin America, not much growth. Look at Africa, no growth at all. Look at Asia, not much growth. Then they start picking up at some point. Africa, a little bit here, uneven here, a little bit here. So Nigerian experience is not typical of Africa. Asia after 1950. But during this period, this gap has become much bigger. So this 19th century and early 20th century is where you see a lot of these gaps actually form. So whatever you want to think about growth, there are really perhaps three phases that you want to sort of think about. And not all of them may be relevant for questions of growth today, but there is the before 1800, which, you know, wasn't completely a stationary world. There were countries that grew for quite a while, then stopped, etc. Then there is this period of the long 19th century from 1800 to sometime around 1930, 1940, where this is when these big gaps have opened up. And then there is the post-war period where a lot of interesting things happen. Perhaps the nature of economic growth has changed, but there isn't any evidence that the gaps that opened up in the long 19th century have closed. A little bit of it might have gotten a bit bigger, but a lot of the action in terms of that map that I showed you is in that long 19th century. If you look at specific countries, you see the same story. Here is Ghana, where you see, if you extend this even with more guesstimates, Ghana is at the same level of India, etc. But it's until the 1990s, there isn't much growth in Ghana. So this gap that's non-trivial but not huge between, say, Britain and Ghana becomes a huge gap by the time we come to this point. So here is Brazil. Actually, Brazil has a period of rapid growth from around 1910, 1920, but then after the post-war period, it's very lackluster. Now, if you go back a little bit more, the pattern is even more interesting. So if you go back to 1500, which is, you know, another turning point because it's the beginning of the colonial age, where a lot of countries, about 2/3 of the world, came under some sort of European dominance. At that point, you can look at the data, various different data sources, and ask yourself, what do we know about prosperity and what do we know about economic growth after this early colonial age? So again, in an effort to make this a little bit more like apples and apples, I'm not going to compare, say, Britain to China or anything like that. Let me look at the countries that are within the colonial empire. So these are countries that were at some point colonized by Europeans. And unfortunately, even Angus Madison doesn't produce guesstimates for GDP per capita during these times, but we have some proxies that are well recognized of prosperity, especially during the pre-industrial period, and one of them that works reasonably well is urbanization. If you're at 1500, only countries that have high agricultural productivity, road networks, and other types of infrastructural organization can support large urban populations. So if you take urbanization as a measure of prosperity in 1500, and then you look at GDP per capita today, what you see is actually something very different from the pictures I've shown you so far. Instead of this this positive relationship that opens up sometimes, stabilizes sometimes, you have a negative relationship, which means that actually the countries that were relatively more prosperous, relatively more civilized, according to that word, in terms of having developed these road networks, high agricultural productivity, and so on. Oh my God, mess here. Okay. Those today are poorer. Which are the richer countries? Look at those here. USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Singapore among the former colonies, a little bit of Chile, Argentina. They were all essentially completely non-urbanized, much lower population density, I'm going to show you before, much lower levels of essentially technology as far as we can measure from qualitative sources. So there is something that during the colonial experience that sort of flips this relationship around. Now, urbanization is still a difficult concept to measure because you're working with a variety of archaeological evidence and qualitative evidence. So another measure that works a little bit similar to urbanization is population density, and we have a little bit more data for population density, and we can cover also sub-Saharan Africa, which is completely missing in data on urbanization. And I'm showing you the same picture here. Those that have relatively more urban, more dense populations at the time of European colonization or thereabouts are now significantly poorer. And you see the same countries up there, Australia, Canada, they were essentially empty compared to places like India, in the Indian subcontinent, the Aztec, Maya, Inca lands, or parts of North Africa and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So what's going on? There is now something even beyond divergence. There is something of a pattern of reversal. So one other question that you can ask, when did this reversal happen? And the answer again points to this long 19th century. So the reversal is associated with, and that data I'm not going to show you to make this slower, but this reversal is associated with industrialization. While this reversal is happening, there's a big divergence in industrial output in these countries. But if you look at just the urbanization rate, it is during this period that countries such as USA, Canada, etc., are becoming rapidly urbanized, are actually taking over countries such as India, whose urbanization is not actually growing that much. So again, there is this spotlight being put on during this long 19th century. Okay, so these are the patterns. So now I'm going to start theorizing about these patterns. So what explains this divergence during the 19th century across a bunch of countries and the reversal between the colonies? And I think you can ask that question at two levels. One is at the proximate cause level, which means what are the affiliated other variables that are changing with this divergence and reversal pattern? And I think the answer there appears to be, again here I'm not going to show you all the data to economize time, is technology and industrialization. So it is the countries that are adopting new technologies or using new technologies, especially associated with industrialization. So there isn't much in terms of industry going on. Actually, quite the opposite. During the 19th century, there is a bit of a deindustrialization under the influence of colonial policies from Britain in India, but industrial output is growing very rapidly. And industrial output, of course, during this time period is also not just using existing techniques, but there's a lot of new technologies that are being adopted and in some cases that are being developed. So that's at the proximate cause level. So there are exceptions if you go to the 20th century of countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., that are growing without industrialization or without much industrialization for obvious reasons. But by and large, especially in this long 19th century and even in the post-war era, industrial output and then later service output growth and doing so with investment and adoption of technology are very much associated with rapid economic growth. But then why do we see that these countries here, like India, or in blue, the other countries which start with high urbanization in 1500 among the former colonies, are not showing the industrialization, are not showing the growth, and these countries here are doing so? And the answer to that takes us a little bit deeper into the realm of the fundamental causes, meaning what is it that makes some countries adopt technology and industrialize and not others? And here there is more debate. There are cultural factors, geographic factors, policy, leadership, and things like that matter. and there are a lot of unknowns. But one factor that I have emphasized in my work is the broad cluster of things that we can refer to as institutions that shape the incentives of at least some actors. And here, I don't want to get into the details, although I'd be very happy to talk about them in the Q&A and the discussion. But some of the work I've done has sort of attempted, again, for the former colonies sample, try to find sort of exogenous shifters of these, this bundle of institutions. Nothing is perfect, but one of the things that works reasonably well, according to a specific theory of what happened during the colonies, is that Europeans set up much worse institutions for the majority of the population in places which they tried to rule indirectly, or they were a small minority trying to extract resources. And the same institutions were attempted but didn't succeed in places where Europeans settled in large numbers, because the lower strata of Europeans sort of revolted against them and resisted them, and the colonial authorities did not have the state capacity or the stomach for violence in order to put down most of these resistance. So there is this divergence between countries in which Europeans settled in large numbers versus they tried to benefit from or exploit while ruling indirectly. So on the basis of this, one source of variation in institutions could be whether Europeans could settle or not. Population density could be related to that, because when there were large populations, that made it less attractive for Europeans to go there. But another one that was rather sharp is the mortality rates that Europeans faced when they settled or when they sent soldiers, and they could measure the soldier mortality rates. This was a key thing because Europe wasn't particularly healthy at the time. In fact, some of the cities were pretty much like death traps, but parts of the industrial world part of the colonial world was much, much more unhealthy. So Europeans in some of the expeditions that they did to Africa had mortality rates, approaching 80%, 90%. So those were really staggering rates, and the European press knew that, and nobody would, in their right mind, try to settle there. So here is a measure of settler mortality in the colonial period, and then you could use any measure of institutions, and these are not perfect, and there are biases, and they are only capturing certain things, but which measure here you use doesn't matter. Here is a rule of law index from the World Bank for today, but again, the same thing would happen for the 60s, 70s, 80s, the same pattern. You have this very strong negative relationship between institutions today and the settler mortality. So the places that I showed you singled out earlier on were also the places that were relatively healthy for Europeans, and some of those places that I singled out earlier on, parts of Africa, Central America, South Asia, were particularly unhealthy for Europeans. The other aspect of this is that if you look at low settler mortality in the colonial period and prosperity today, you see a very, very strong relationship as well. So this variable from 150, 200 years ago somehow predicts a lot of GDP per capita today. So whatever your exact causal channel, this relationship here is interesting. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to interpret this causal channel, that this settler mortality here acts only through the institutions, so it doesn't create what economists would call omitted variable bias or things like that. So if you do that, you end up with this sort of relationship. So I'm showing you this here is the causal relationship according to this procedure, not perfect, not beyond reproach, but the estimate that you would end up, which is essentially what it's saying is that there is a historical persistent element to these institutions. Now, I've already shown you that there's a lot of variation. Some countries are growing, Brazil is not growing, and Chile is growing. So the colonial history is not everything. But there are some elements of the colonial history that are major contributors to that economic growth. Now, I emphasize that the channels via which this works are often related to technology adoption. So here I'm doing the same thing, but on the left-hand side, instead of looking at GDP per capita or prosperity today, I'm looking at these affiliates or the proximate causes, various measures of technology. So here on the left, I'm looking at exactly the same procedure, but what economists call total factor productivity, which is essentially how efficiently the economy is organized, though computed as a residual. On the right-hand side, I messed them around. It should be They look very similar, but this one should be on the left, this one should be on the right. But here on the right, therefore, I'm looking at an advanced technology index, which is what fraction of your exports are in technologies that are classified as advanced technologies by the Census Bureau in the United States. Again, not a perfect list, but with either measure, you see that whatever is this institutional variable from history, it's predicting your efficiency of economic production and technology, and how advanced your technology is. So before I conclude, I want to do three more things. One is to emphasize that when I'm talking about institutions and the historical roots of institutions, I don't want to create the impression that institutions are only historically determined and cannot be changed. In fact, other dimensions of institutions matter a lot, and one that a lot of people put emphasis on, and again, it's a mixed bag. It has many things in it. It's not perfectly measured, but it's democracy. So countries' history does affect their likelihood of becoming democracy, becoming a stable democracy, or becoming a stable autocracy, but many countries also move in and out of democracy. So one thing you can do during the last 60 years, you can say, what happens when a country that was previously an autocracy democratizes? And again, here, there are many decisions here that one is making. Democracy doesn't need to be a 0-1 measure. It has many dimensions, etc. So I'm taking a lot of prior steps. So it's like, here's something I prepared earlier. But here is a 0-1 measure of democracy. So 0 here means the year of democratization. And what you see is that countries that democratize, for a while, don't do that much better than non-democracies. But after about 5-6 years, they start growing faster. And they grow fast for about 20 years and become about 15 to 20% richer than they would have been had it not been for their democratization. So institutions that are quite separate, and this doesn't correlate so much with, these changes don't correlate so much with historical episodes. So it's not this historically determined aspect of institutions. It seems to have a major effect. So again, this is sort of placing the emphasis on institutions. I can also show you that in the form of more econometric estimates, but let me skip that. But let me show you one other thing from that experience, which is South Korea. And this is the sort of variation that's driving the data. So here is the residuals from a regression version of that. And the red dots here are South Korea before democratization, and the green dots are South Korea after democratization. I'm showing you this to just give you an intuition for why democracy, I'm claiming at least, is associated with more rapid growth, and because there are a lot of stories about how South Korea developed because it was a authoritarian, pro-growth country under General Park. Well, actually, the reality is, yes, under General Park, there were certain interesting things that happened, but really faster growth in South Korea is over the last 30 years or so after it's democratized. And it's this kind of countries that are growing slower under autocracy and growing faster under democracy that are the basis of the claim that I made. By the way, historical institutions are very separate from this democratization, but they still matter. So meaning that if you look at this settler mortality like thing that looks at the historical institutions, they predict growth, especially during periods of turbulence. So in the 1990s, in the 1970s, if you have better institutions, going back to the colonial period, that still seems to have an effect on growth. So taking stock, huge differences in levels and growth performance. A large portion of this is in prosperity have emerged during the era of industrialization, that long 19th century. Technology and institutions are key. You cannot understand that gap opening up without industrialization. You cannot understand industrialization without investments in some of these new techniques, railways, factories, new machinery, etc. And I have argued, at least, you may or may not be fully convinced, but I have argued that institutions are an important part of that. Those institutions have a major historical, persistence, and path-dependent component, but it's not all history. Various countries that have democratized have done so, and the major channel by which democracies seem to do better is also very interesting. It's not just technology, more taxation, more education, better health, somewhat more competitive environment, as well as technology. So there are very interesting details about what happens to countries once they democratize. And technology is not actually something that always has a steady path. Actually, I told you about TFP. The US, despite all of the talk of innovation, is doing really badly in terms of TFP and some objective measures of technology. So there are some questions about what's going on. And then same thing for other industrializations. And then this is my last slide. I wanted to show you a few of the patterns so that it anchors the discussion. And I wanted to show you there are certain things that we know about these patterns. But I don't want to end by emphasizing the things that we know, because there are many things that we don't know. So we don't know, for example, what is the equivalent of that industrialization technology that was so important? Today, there is a lot of innovation in the tech sector, but it doesn't always translate into economic growth. So there are some questions there. What does it mean for less developed economies to grow? Does it mean that they have to adopt existing technologies? Do they have to develop their own technologies? Do they have to do it by replicating the institutional pathways of more advanced nations? Or does every country have a different institutional path with some commonalities and with some differences? What type of policy? So I've been very silent on policies, but obviously once you start thinking about the things that I said, human capital, health, competitive environment, those are policies. R&D subsidies. Is it, if I've emphasized technology, does it mean that R&D subsidies are going to be the most important tool for economic growth? That's an open question. What is the role of markets? So could you create some of these incentives for technology adoption via free markets, via regulated markets, non-markets, planning? There are a lot of questions there as well. And then, there are some outliers. China and East Asia, they fit some of the patterns, but there are some ways in which they are completely different. And so that creates some other set of questions. And then finally, what are the skills of the workforce? So I didn't emphasize that, but it actually turns out to be one of the critical things. I just didn't have time to get into it. And then, of course, we are in the midst of a lot of investments in AI, new digital technologies. Does that change any of this? So I leave those questions for you to answer. Thank you. Do I sit now? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. You can sit now. And thank you, Laura. I'm sure Roberto has a lot of questions too. But I want to first emphasize something that you've said, which is some of these patterns of growth or sort of economic well-being are sort of rooted deep in history. Others seem to be others seem to be changeable.
Exactly, 100%. Thank you for saying that again. I wanted to emphasize that one more time because it's so important. Thank you. Yes.
The same goes for the determinants of economic well-being, determinants of economic growth. You've placed emphasis on institutions, and I want to get into that term in a second. But you've placed emphasis on institutions as the determinant of economic well-being. That and the same argument goes also, I think you've made the argument that some of these institutions are rooted in history. There's a long shadow of history that's sort of determining. In your work, it's about experience under colonialism and to the extent to which different colonies experience settler mortality. Although there's as much variation in GDP per capita among non-colonies as well. So, but if the argument is about institutions, presumably variations in institutions is also driving that variation across non-colonies, the difference between Japan and Afghanistan. But that those institutions are also, some of their determinants are deeply rooted in history. There's a long shadow of history, but others, and you show that in the context of democratic institutions, they can change quite rapidly also. And I guess we're interested in those things that you can actually change, looking forward to things that for which we have agency. Now, so that by way of background, I think I've just reiterated some of the points that you've made. But a lot of our attention here focuses on understanding what institutions mean, unpacking it, and considering different possibilities of institutional trajectories that might be more appropriate, both because they drive greater inclusivity, but also more appropriate because they may be more adapted to today's technologies and the differences in technology's trajectories, I think, something we want to come back to as well in terms of whether industrialization is still playing the same role as it is. So the question I want to ask you is, can you say a little bit more about what you mean by institutions and how you would recognize good institutions from bad institutions? Is it about, do you mean it, in different parts of your talk, it meant different things. You use the rule of law. Can you say what you mean by that?
Mm-hmm.
I think some of the indexes here are property rights indexes of property rights protection. Democracy, of course, is, I think, mostly sort of a measure of the degree of electoral rights, right to vote. So what is it in your mind that is sort of institutions? How much variation can we, sort of envisage under that heading, while still being good in the sense of being conducive to inclusive economic performance? How can we tell, bad institutions from good institutions? So we can get into that discussion a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can have this discussion for as long as you want, and it can take very long because epistemic discussions always do, and that's part of the reason why I didn't define it, because it could have taken much longer. And there isn't a complete agreement. So in my work, for example, in the in my book Why Nations Fail, co-written with James Robinson, we talk of extractive institutions and inclusive institutions. And by extractive institutions, we mean those that have been designed or end up with in a situation in which a small group monopolizes both economic and political power, and they can use that power for their advantage, which is often in the form of either violating other people's property rights or monopolizing all the assets such as monopolies or trading opportunities, or sort of tilting certain rules, formal or informal, in their favor. Like, for example, you get special treatment in courts, your companies cannot be sued, or your companies get the best contracts or the best possibilities. So the whole system sort of being rigged in the favor of a small minority. It's not the only aspect of institutions, and for example, just like Danny anticipated, there are other aspects of institutions that you want to think about when you want to consider why is it that Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, China, not always, but especially over the last 60, 70 years, have shown an ability to grow that doesn't seem to be completely replicated in other parts of the world. And I think if you want to think about that, you need to bring other aspects of institutions, including state capacity, into the picture. But leaving that aside for later discussion, the inclusive institutions is defined as the opposite of extractive institutions. So essentially, you have well-defined property rights that apply to everybody, so nobody's assets or labor can be stolen. The public infrastructure, educational institutions, and laws are such that people are not excluded from economic opportunities. And the rule of law is a strange concept, because I think a better term for it would have been equality before the law, but people always refer to it as rule of law. I think rule of law is an important part of inclusive institutions because it means that people are treated the same before the law. So that's this important element of creating a level playing field so that things are not rigged in favor of one group or another. Now, when I say these things, I don't want to necessarily equate inclusive institutions with those that generate economic growth, because there are possibilities for extractive institutions to generate economic growth. So if you have a bunch of favored firms, they may also have access to cheap credit, and that cheap credit may be quite conducive for them to expand their market a lot, or even export under certain circumstances once some other preconditions have been met. So extractive economic institutions can generate economic growth as well, but our claim, and the evidence here is one other piece of the argument, is that extractive economic growth, or growth under extractive institutions, is less stable, and even when it happens, it comes with built-in inequalities and problems that don't make it very sustainable. And again, I think China is one case that one needs to discuss. And then the final thing I want to say here is that institutions are not forever. Even when you look at the colonial aspect that I emphasize as being an important part of history, that is not forever. So the U.S. in all of these things appears relatively well. Again, we can debate whether some of the international institutions that code these data are biased in favor of the U.S., etc. But I think there is no doubt that U.S. institutions have changed a lot over the last 2 decades. They have certain major problems, and those problems probably have become amplified over the last quite recently. So there is no guarantee that a country that looked quite good as an inclusive institution 30 years ago is always going to be there.
So I'm glad you brought up the U.S. because I was going to ask you about the U.S. because the U.S. was in your book, How Nations Fail? Why Nations Fail. I think the U.S. was the benchmark inclusive institution.
Not benchmark, but yes.
It was sort of the example. Yeah. And now you've said that sort of U.S. institutions have changed. So I mean, the first thing that makes me think is that actually not much has changed in the U.S. in terms of actually the formal institutional structure of the country.
No.
So I think a lot of this distinction that you're making between inclusive versus extractive, it has something to do about the way that existing formal institutional structures are behaving and performing. So it's an observational, quality of these institutions rather than any formal or legal aspect in particular. Is that right?
Well, I wouldn't say it that way. I would say that I think institutions are about rules, laws, and other features as formulated and as enforced. So if you don't formulate them right, you are not going to have, you're going to have very different elements. But once you formulate them in a specific way, it doesn't mean that they are enforced or they are sort of obeyed. So both of those matter. So the fact that the US has a constitution that doesn't create a king is important. But if the constitutional checks and balances are not obeyed, are not enforced, and a variety of things make them dysfunctional, then what's written in the Constitution will not have quite the same force.
The UK has an unwritten constitution with a king, but there's a sort of long-standing tradition that the king actually doesn't meddle.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if it's not really about modes of behavior than the formal institutions. You keep bracketing China, and I can't.
We'll come back to it. But let me actually say one other thing. Democracy, for example, the measure that I use there, is also a formal measure. So you'll see some of the countries, if you look at it, some of the countries that are democratic according to that, don't behave like democracies. So Argentina is temporarily a democracy between military dictatorships in the 70s, but that's not a democracy that behaves like a democracy. But despite that, the fact that according to this definition there are elections and parties can compete semi-freely, etc., that seems to have some weight. But is that the only thing that has weight? No. If countries have elections, but elections are not obeyed, or they are vehicles for one group to dominate or repress the other, that doesn't lead to very good outcomes. But both of them are bundled often in our institutional definitions, unfortunately. Yes.
So an alternative story that I think would make room for China as well is that institutions matter, but it's a kind of a different kind of institutions. It's whether you have in countries what might be called developmental coalitions or not. And so developmental coalitions would be a brand of something in between inclusive and extractive, because it would be inclusive for a relatively large number of actors, but also with significant number of people left out. But the issue would be that significant segments of business and wealth creators are brought along with the political elite in a project that simultaneously advances the interests of the elite, but also large segments of the productive segments of society. So you get simultaneously economic development with the sort of the national goals of the political elite as well satisfied. So that would be one way to characterize some of these East Asian experiences, but that would also be a way of characterizing the United States under in the 19th century as well, because as much as one may want to call the United States an inclusive country, of course, a very important part of the population was left off, obviously, to some extent, still so. So do you want to come in at this point, Roberto?
I could, yes. So let me ask you, there are 3 questions. I think the common element of these questions is that they all have to do with the programmatic implications of your empirical points. And the first question regards your concept of path dependency. So your whole narrative from beginning to end is, in a sense, a narrative about path dependency, about how the past influences the future. And you tell the story of the settler colonies having gone one way because something happened in the past.
Yes.
And my question is, what's the relation of that idea of path dependency to democracy? Because one conception of democracy is that the whole point of democracy, deepened or radicalized, is to defeat path dependency. These societies are like planets in their orbits, and the idea of the Democrat, or at least of the radical Democrat, is to knock them out of their orbits. So isn't democracy inversely related to path dependency? And isn't path dependency, rather than being a constant, a variable? So that the influence that the past exercises over the future depends. And one of the things that it depends on is the organization of political life. So
Should I react to that, or should I wait for the other questions?
React to that.
Okay. All right, react to that. So the first part of your observation is 100% right. This is all about path dependence. And I use the term path dependence rather than institutional persistence when I want to emphasize that it's not that you have a set of institutions and arrangements and they persist unchanged. It's that history determines the path of change. And you are also right that once you have bad initial conditions, the problem, whether it's in my conception or it's in Danny's conception, I'll come back to about developmental coalitions, is one of change. How do we change that bad path and make things that are better? And my read of the history is that there are several cases in which exactly that happens, although whether it happens through radical democracy or a variety of other things, including developmental.
That being what?
That the weight of history is reversed. But in many cases, that weight of history seems to be very difficult to reverse. So let me give you 2 examples to make that point. One is Costa Rica and Guatemala. So 2 countries that were part once the Kingdom of Guatemala, and they both had democratic periods. But the initial conditions in terms of colonialism was very different in the 2 parts of the country, and the way that democracy worked in the 2 countries, both in terms of threats against that democracy, polarization, etc., and the repression during the non-democratic period was completely different. As a result, both economically and democratically, Costa Rica has been much more successful than Guatemala. So there is an element that Costa Rica today is much, much more equal than it was in the 19th century, which was when it was an oligarchy. But still, history does matter.
What specific colonial experience drove those values?
So in particular, Guatemala did have a very large indigenous population, so they set up more of the encomienda type systems tying that indigenous population to land, very unequal land ownership, very large sizes of plots when the coffee economy started, whereas Costa Rica was a bit of a sort of a periphery with no major indigenous population, and as a result, it did not have the same sort of repressive apparatus, even though at some point there was big land ownership in Costa Rica. Over time, those didn't last, and by the time of the late 19th century, there was more of a smallholder economy, quite a marginal but smallholder economy, and that smallholder economy, but there was a military coups and some amount of repression, but never the same sort of repression that often was against the indigenous population in Guatemala.
But that's a very interesting example. So you could say what you've said about Costa Rica makes it sound that Costa Rica is the example of a category which is a petty bourgeois economy, an economy dominated by smallholders, by petty proprietors, and in principle that's relatively hospitable to the development of this inclusiveness. The problem of that kind of society, like the economy of the United States before the Civil War, is that it can't take it's not easy for it to take the next step. How does it retain the impulse to decentralization and property-owning democracy in the face of the imperatives of scale? And when then comes the moment of aggregation of resources at vast scale, how does it reinvent its institutional formula so that it can be adapted to that new historical reality? So that's a different situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are very good questions, and I don't think Costa Rica has done perfectly and has.
But I'm not saying that in the spirit of criticizing Costa Rica, because that then becomes the challenge that has a constitutive significance for the future.
So just to draw you out on that, Roberto, because you likened Costa Rica, Guatemala distinction a little bit to
the United States,
U.S., the northern part of the U.S. versus
Yes.
the southern part, where in the southern part you have repressive labor systems that prove to be much more difficult. And then in the north, you have the small holding, petty bourgeois
and
society.
both of them, both the economy of the north and the economy of the south, were destroyed in the aftermath of the Civil War.
Right, and then just to tie it with a point that you made last week, which is sort of, if those were the permissive conditions in the United States, in the north at least, they needed something else after the Civil War, which I believe.
They need an act of constitutional or institutional invention. That's what's missing. But that's the kind of invention which is very difficult. But if it were to take place, would then subvert this power of path dependency and knock the planet out of its orbit.
So I think that's right, but that's not an historically unrooted process. So that invention and whether it sticks are all historically
favored or
rooted.
disfavored and so forth. Now let me ask you the second question.
And by the way, that scale issue is also critical, and the U.S. has
of course.
very badly struggled with that.
Of course. Of course.
The U.S. economic growth in the 19th centuries did exploit scale after the Civil War, but in a very costly way that it created much more, exactly.
Became then the vehicle by which this was resolved to the detriment of the petty bourgeois solution.
Yes.
Now,
And we want to come back to the question of whether that's still the model that we need in the future, or
Yes, it may not be, exactly, that's-
different
yes.
the
technological
petty bourgeois
conditions.
thing is not the model.
And the
But
scale
question
issue is very
whether-
different.
But whether the reconciliation of radical decentralization with aggregation of scale through some institutional invention is necessary.
Okay, let's make sure we come back to what
that.
this implies for the future.
Exactly.
But you had more questions.
Yes, so second question concerns the reference occasionally in your narrative to industry.
So,
Industrialization. And everyone knows industrialization, conventional industrialization until recently has been the shortcut to growth. With this narrative of developmental economics until recently, that there is this shortcut, that there are the fundamentals of education of institutions, but that within the limit is imposed by those fundamentals, you can go very far through this shortcut. Now, this is a remarkable fact, that during the period of the shortcut of the conventional industrialization, there was progress, sometimes dramatic, which your charts show. And now in the period of the knowledge economy, as we call it, the progress is not there to the extent that we expected it. So there's an immense...
The progress from industrialization.
Yes, that is, but this,
Overall
but
progress.
it's hard to compare because the conventional industrialization was a sector, manufacturer. And the knowledge economy, properly considered, is not a sector. It is insular, it's a variety, it's a small part of the population, but it's multi-sectoral, it applies to everything.
Yeah.
And under the reign of what should have been an enormous stimulus to enterprise and invention, we have the opposite to a very large extent. And it seems to me that the whole meaning of your slide, your narrative, would be affected by the answer that you give to this question. Why has it been a disappointment? And what does that show retrospectively
I think that's a
about-
very, very important question, but I don't think it's that organically tied to what I've shown, because exactly as Danny also observed in his excellent summary, you know, I am talking about a particular historical episode for some aspects of it, like for example, the importance of industry, will probably not translate into the 21st century in an unmodified form. Because you know, even in the most industrialized countries, the share of the economy that's now services is much, much larger.
Of course.
So I think
But that just means that the problem and the opportunity are much larger.
may or
Because
may
now
not
it's
be,
a
may
story
or may
about the
not be.
whole economy.
I think that's that is a whole different set of issues that I think is one of the the other sessions
Yes,
we're going
it
to come
is.
to.
Yes.
So I actually think that knowledge economy, although I don't like that term very much, as currently conceived, is very unequalizing both within countries and between countries,
As it's currently developed.
as it's
yes.
currently developed and as it's currently being invested. So, and it may also even prevent some of these types of growth experiences that we're talking about, although that's a question that we should come back to. So I think I'm not claiming that there is a very easy lesson from the long 19th century to the
To the knowledge.
21st
to
and
the
21st
insular
century.
knowledge.
Yes, exactly.
So now let me ask my third question.
So that's a very interesting topic, and I would love to talk more
So
about
let me
that.
ask my third question, which in a way ties to the other two. So in what areas of institutional innovation now would there be the greatest potential of innovation, period, technological and institution, for the standpoint of the productivist inclusion, which is really the hidden ideal in this conversation?
So let me actually
can I ask-
answer that question together with Danny's question of developmental coalitions. You know, as a description of what happens in many countries, I like that developmental coalitions. But I think the nature of the events, at least as I read them, is that, however, they're not stable things. Those are just coalitions that happen within a given configuration of power, within given institutions, and they don't guarantee that such coalitions will be effective or persistent. So in some sense, my answer, therefore, to both understanding those developmental coalitions and to Roberto would be, you know, to go to the framework of another book that I wrote, which of course I don't have time to describe, but it's The Narrow Corridor, where we describe the institutional trajectories of countries as a battle between state capacity and more bottom-up participation. So if you want to call it decentralization, you can do so, although that would not have been my term. So in some sense, the important thing, I think, to understand many growth experiences is how state power is used, both effectively and for what purpose, And effectiveness is something that's determined partly in history, partly as organizational, and that purpose is in the context of both society's resistance to that state capacity and also the extent of decentralization.
So there are two projects that to me seem especially promising for the development of this idea that we were beginning to insinuate. One is to influence the evolution of technology in a way that empowers labor rather than replacing it. So take the contemporary discussion of AI as an example of this. It's as if the dominant idea is that the objective is to create a machine that replaces the mind, that's a surrogate for the mind. But
Replaces everything.
Yes, but the objective should be creating a machine that is the opposite of the mind, that a machine that can do everything that we've learned how to repeat, and they can team up with human beings with imagination. And that should be the whole focus. But that doesn't happen spontaneously. That has to be created. And let's say that's the technological front. And what's then the institutional front? The institutional front is an innovation in the property regime, in private law, not in public law, not in the kinds of things that regard the partnership of the state with enterprise and the result, for example, in industrial policy, but in the fundamental terms on which property is distributed or shared in. So you could say, we'll have the dominant form of property will be disaggregated. And in the history of law, most forms of property are disaggregated. So that we can have the maximum of economic deconcentration or decentralization combined with economies of scale. And that's through innovation in the property regime, innovation in private law. But we'll have a carve-out. We'll have a carve-out for the traditional 19th century unified form of property, which vests all the component powers of property in the absolute owner, because that has a great advantage for experimentalism, which is that it allows the absolute owner to do something at his own risk that no one else believes in. And that will then be the vanguard with respect to institutions.
Can you say something more about how this innovation in private property law regime produces the kind of inclusion and dissemination of these new
So the
technologies?
problems that we were discussing at the beginning, in the first point, is that under the economy like the economy of the United States in the first half of the 19th century, we have all this petty proprietorship, but we have no aggregation of scale. So how can we reconcile radical decentralization with aggregations of scale? In principle, it's by saying we will radicalize decentralization of economic power, but we will at the same time relativize the absoluteness of the property right. The property right will be conditional, it will be fragmentary, it will be temporary. Financial markets do that in finance, but this is the generalization of the principle for everything. But we won't do that in every part of the economy. We'll have a sector of the economy which is open to the traditional absolute property right for the reason I described.
I need to digest that.
Yeah, so I'm not sure whether I completely understand that either. But let me just say, I think this is also something we're going to discuss more in the future. But essentially, the first half of your comment is about what technology can do, should do, is doing, is essentially the thesis that I very much agree with, and it's also the thesis of my most recent book, Power and Progress. But I think it's not just about decentralization versus scale. It's also about power, which companies, which things, and it's also about something that Danny also sometimes emphasizes, ideas. So the way that we develop technologies is very much determined by what ideas are dominant in the centers where technological decisions are made. So
but the crucial premise is that technology has no imminent intrinsic logic of evolution. It has the logic of evolution we give it.
Well, once ideas are, certain
and
ideas are there, it has a path, but
Yeah.
it can be changed, absolutely. Yes, that's again the thesis that, you know, the
So-
directed technological change approach that I have argued that technology is highly malleable. There are certain constraints, you cannot do everything that you want, but there are a lot of choices about technology. But whether those come down to private law versus decentralization, et cetera, I think those are things we need to investigate more.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of the significance of this notion, because it goes that both Daron and Roberto have emphasized about the malleability of the direction of technological change. Because I think it runs against so much
Of dominant thinking.
Conventional thinking
Yeah.
today about that the technological change sort of just moves in a particular direction and the rest of society simply has to adjust to it. Whereas I think what Daron and Roberto are both saying, and I think it's an issue that we will come back to when we talk about technology and technology economy in other sessions, is exactly how to make that a practical idea of how you can steer technology in a way that's more that produces using technology as a way to complement and augment labor, for example, rather than replace it. So we will definitely, that's a key theme here, and I think, of course, Daron has written very extensively on this issue.
Too much.
But it is, I mean, I think it's fair to say that 5 or 6 years ago, if you mentioned this to the average economist, I mean, they would look at you as if you were crazy, that this is, you can't steer technology. And now it's becoming much more commonplace. I think that's very important, that we'll come back to. Now, so the relationship between sort of, state capacity, decentralization, bottom-up versus top-down processes, so forth, I think it's something that.
So I could just complete one thing on the question of the developmental coalition.
Okay. And I want to make sure that there's a chance for people.
So what is the political, social context in which this problem arises? We began to discuss that just last week. So most people are poor and disorganized. Their horizon of aspiration, rather than being proletarian, is petty bourgeois. So most people in the world form a kind of subjective petty bourgeoisie. They're not members of a small business class. They're not rich enough or powerful enough for that. But that's what they would like to be. Unfortunately, the object of their aspiration is, for the most part, not only unrealistic, but regressive. So
we've disagreed on that.
Yes, but okay. But so what's necessary is for there to be a productivist counter-elite which tries to come to power by offering the majority, the subjective petty bourgeoisie, a more progressive alternative to the forms in which they conceive their aspiration. So there we are in agreement, in fact. But this re-engineering, this reformulation of their aspiration is then the end product of a long political and ideological struggle. It's not something that arises spontaneously. And so the combination of the institutional innovations that we were discussing with this coalition, uniting the subjective petty bourgeoisie with the productivist counter-elite, is the solution to the problem of knocking the planets out of their orbits.
You mean Trump's tariffs? There's still a lot that we could discuss, but I want to make sure that you have a chance to come in with thoughts, comments, questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor, for coming here and giving us a talk. I just have to say a moment of fanboying. I grew up reading about the role of institutions, so it's great to see you here. I have two questions, two very quick questions. First one is about the path dependency that was discussed initially. And I think when we actually look at one of the slides that you initially showed us in the 1500 GDP urbanization thing, it tells us that maybe the agrarian institution that's suitable for that kind of economic structure is not actually closely aligned with the institutional structure that's suited for industrialization. So if we extend that logic to the future, if we look at more of a knowledge-based or service-based institution, maybe there could be a bit of an inconsistency between industrial institution and the knowledge-based one. So isn't that a bit of a pessimistic view in that like it's already determined who's going to succeed in this kind of environment versus the others? So that's the first question. The second question, I didn't write it down, so I'll come back.
Well, I think that's an interesting thought. But my interpretation isn't that agrarian institutions that led to, say, large-scale grain production or large-scale output are by their nature unchangeable and inconsistent with industrialization. It is in that specific historical episode where Europeans took over some of these agrarian institutions, transformed them. Sometimes they remade them from scratch like they did in the Caribbean or in Brazil under slavery and imported slaves. And in others, they sort of modified its function, but did so within a particular political context that led to a very different path of these agrarian institutions that you see in Europe. So in Europe, for example, the countries where you had the agrarian production increases were also more likely to industrialize. So that was not a smooth process. Sometimes it did lead to a lot of conflict, as in France, parts of Germany. Sometimes it was a little bit more based on compromise, as in England and Britain, where landowners were sort of brought in with enough guarantees and sometimes became part of the ruling elite through other means. But the particular historical colonial context made that impossible because the very repressive use of labor, tribute system, coercion made these economies, just like they did with the US South, by the way, very inconsistent with any type of adaptation to the industrial new technologies. You're the boss. I'm just a guest.
Just scream.
Coming to speak today.
Speak
And,
loud.
Yeah, my question relates to, do you think during the digital age and sort of the advent of AI, the differences in economic growth between those countries that had firm colonial institutions and those countries that didn't would widen? Or sort of how should we think about that?
So that's an excellent question, and my take there, I think, is probably similar to what Roberto would say on the basis of his previous comment, that depends on how we develop the technologies. So if you look at the gap between the middle income countries, say the really low income economies, I think there are some structural problems with instability, huge levels of corruption, that's a different kettle of fish. But if you look at middle income countries, their economic place in the current global order depends on the things that they have in abundance. Middle and low skilled labor that can work in some sort of industries or some services, like in the case of India, that are offshore. That's not the only path for economic growth, because you can have sometimes economic growth just based on internal demand. But in many of these economies, again, mobilizing that low and middle income, sort of low and middle skilled labor would be very important for that economic growth. So depending on where AI goes, whether it completely sidelines those sorts of skills or whether it creates new opportunities for those skills, I think it will also shape the prospects for these economies to converge or to have growth spurts, etc.
So just to I think that's a very important point, so I just want to highlight it some more and bring it out. If I say anything that you disagree with, interrupt me. So I want to make sure that we're getting either a identical story, or if we disagree, that we're clear about what the disagreement is. So for the vast majority of periods since the Industrial Revolution, we had a pattern of growth that relied on industrialization. And what was special about industrialization and the reason that manufacturing eventually produced a kind of a model of inclusive capitalism in societies that developed the requisite institutions like labor unions, political democracy, and so forth, was that there was a match between the skill demands of the most productive segments of the economy, manufacturing, and the predominant level of skill that prevailed in those economies, which are largely low or semi-skilled individuals, or in terms of today's America, individuals without college education. So when you have the most productive segments of the economy essentially relying mostly on the skills that are widely available, then you have the possibilities of creating middle-class societies as long as you have institutions that ensure that workers share in the value that is created in the economy.
So far, 100% agreement. Excellent
Okay,
stuff.
wow. So what is different as we look now, and what's been different now for a while, so it's not the future we're talking about. That's true also of today's India, for example, is that because manufacturing, technology of manufacturing, especially globally competitive technology, globally competitive manufacturing has changed over recent decades, becoming much more skill and capital intensive. That there has been instead of a match that I mentioned before, now we have much greater divergence between the skill requirements of the most productive segments of the economy, that is either advanced manufacturing or advanced tradable services like IP, BPO, and other kinds of tradable services. And the sort of the skill levels that still prevail, which is still for the most part less than college educated labor. And so that divergence, which now is a common feature of all our contemporary economies, whether it is the rich economies or the poorest economies today, because even poorest economies are having difficulty growing off the back of manufacturing, given that they have to compete in the same global marketplace with rather similar technologies if they want to plug into global value chains and so forth. That means that it is becoming simultaneously harder to generate a lot of growth because it's only the relatively top levels of skills that can benefit and they can be part of these new technologies. And it's also becoming very difficult to generate middle-class societies because the vast majority of workers with less than college education or very low levels of education in low-income countries can be part of the more advanced segments of the economy. That, to me, is the fundamental challenge of economic growth, creating middle-class societies, inclusion as we go forward. So I think there's an implicit solution to this dilemma, which we've been sort of talking about and going around, which is how, if one could steer technology, whether it's AI, other kinds of technologies, in ways that are actually benefiting not just or demanding or augmenting not just the most skilled segments of the labor force, but are directly complementary, augmenting the capabilities
that are accessible.
and are accessible.
Mass, including the mass and small business.
I don't know what petit bourgeois in the way that you're using it is always, I find it off-putting because I find it so denigrating. But, so it's, I know you're using it as a kind of a Marxist category without any value judgment. But I think if most, people, if you call them petty, they would find that they're not insulting. So now I've lost my train of thought.
But yeah, no, 99% agreed on the second part of your
So-
statement as well. The only thing I would say is that there has been a much greater divergence between the industry needs and skills. I would say there has been some divergence with the prospect of even bigger divergence with AI. That is the really concerning thing. So despite all of the emphasis on skill bias, there is still, we are in an economy that really relies on manual labor. Manual labor is less valued for both institutional and technology reasons. It gets compensated less, but we absolutely depend on manual labor, and we absolutely depend on labor that performs certain cognitive tasks in offices. And the project of Silicon Valley is to completely remove that dependence. So the much greater is, I think, is the fear that I have about the future.
So there's even more scope for this happening in the future. So, but there, the argument has been made that many of these, that AI can also displace college professors. So it can also be sort of, much more than automation, for example, might have the prospects of being helpful to lower skilled workers.
We'll see. We'll talk about that. That's an issue I have a lot to say on, but probably today is not the right time to do that.
Okay. David?
So I have questions on two parts of the global economy for you. The first is a country you've discussed to some extent, but not gone into detail on, which is China.
Are you putting on your microphone?
Is my making worse?
Try it again. Sorry.
I have questions on two parts of the global economy for you.
The first is China. So in your book, Why Nations Fail, you talk about the role of extractive institutions in China and how you fear that China may not achieve first world status because of those extractive institutions without democratic reform. I'm curious how you feel about that prediction today, and whether you think some of China's slowdown is related to that, whether they'll get income trap versus Japan and Korea in terms of Chinese development. The second region of the world is Western Europe versus the US, and the growing economic gap we're seeing between the US and Western European countries. Whether you think there's an institutionalist path and an explanation there, whether the more traditional macroeconomic analysis focusing on productivity differences, etc., is more appropriate, whether you have any thoughts on that question.
Thank you. Both excellent questions. So, on the US versus Europe, one narrative that's become very popular over the last, few years is, Europe is badly regulated, that's why it's not growing. Well, actually, I think that's not quite right. First of all, I think if you look at regulations, they're even worse in the United States. There's so many regulations that are incredibly inefficient in the United States that I think have no parallel in Europe. So the regulatory failures in most sectors are in the United States as much as in Europe. Especially anything to do with public infrastructure has just become much, much worse in the United States. Second, related to that, Europe is actually not doing badly in all sorts of sectors. If you look at aerospace, if you look at telecommunications, if you look at health, if you look at cars, Europe is not doing worse than the United States. There are some places where it's a little bit better, some places that it's a little worse. The one place where Europe is doing much worse than the United States is technology. And that has some elements of regulation. So US inefficient regulations have not extended to the tech sector. In fact, the opposite has been completely unregulated in some very dangerous things. Whereas Europe, I think, has never found critical mass in technology. A lot of the European talent in AI or other related fields are all in Silicon Valley. So the US sort of took a particular path in technology, the tech sector, and it sort of worked out, and I think a lot of the US dynamism right now is coming from the tech sector, but it's both for good and bad. I mean, some of that dynamism is also, Wild West cowboy dynamism. So it may look good for GDP, but especially for the questions of the direction of technology, it may spell trouble. And then the other big issue, which I think used to get a lot of emphasis a couple of years ago and is not anymore, for a variety of reasons that I don't claim to understand fully, U.S. acted much better during the two large macroeconomic crises. During the financial crisis, in terms of the banking system not becoming completely clogged, and during COVID in terms of sort of weathering the storm. And Europe, for the most part, especially some of the European powerhouses like Germany and the UK, didn't. And I think that's the other element of Europe falling behind. So it is actually quite macroeconomic rather than structural, although at some point, macroeconomic problems that are not resolved, like in the UK case, may turn into structural problems. So I think the tech divergence is very important, but I wouldn't necessarily say everything is failing in the European case. In terms of China, I mean, I think that's a longer discussion. So I think China is going through a very transformative period, and it's completely without any equivalent in history, in the sense that I don't think there has been any other extractive regime in the world that has put so much emphasis on innovation. Really, the amount of resources and money, talent, and political prestige that's going towards innovation in China is remarkable. There are many areas in which this is creating inefficiencies because of the top-down nature, but it's also creating very rapid catch-up and sometimes more than catch-up. I think DeepSeek is really very, very remarkable. I think it also highlights some of the strengths and weaknesses of the Chinese case. That, what is DeepSeek doing? Well, it actually did something completely different than what American companies were doing, which is a lot of innovation. But it did so using already very common techniques, some of them already used, well known for 30 years, more than 30 years, reinforcement learning, mixture of expert models. Some of them very commonly used, like the transformer model, distillation, etc. That Western companies and American companies, chain of thought things, which some of the recent models from Mistral or OpenAI, Anthropic, etc., were also working on. But it did so with great engineering success and with a combination. So where will it go from here? I don't know, but it's certainly true that China is showing much greater emphasis on innovation, and especially in the field of AI. If you look at academic papers written on AI or machine learning, the number of Chinese researchers is just staggering. There were zero, essentially, researchers in that area or related areas 25 years ago, and now it's like more common to see Chinese researchers than American researchers. So that energy, we'll see where it's going to go. But on the other hand, that top-down approach is also creating a lot of problems in many sectors of the Chinese economy, which somehow, again, this is where the state capacity matters, have been sort of dealt with in a temporary manner. But I emphasize temporary here. We'll see whether that's how that's going to play out.
I just want to ask you one thing on China, because I think China is such a big part of not just today's world economy, but in terms of the overall landscape of economic growth and performance for the last 50 years or so. So I think it's important to get China right. I get the sense from the way you portray China that it is an exception, or at best sits uncomfortably with the way that you view the world. That's why you just end up by stressing it's temporary. We'll see where it goes. There's another way of presenting China, which is that for all of its faults, it's a kind of something. It's an example of a system that you should emulate, albeit without some of the adverse parts of repression and so forth, single party. So I don't think that those are the part. But am I correct in characterizing your view that you're very much in the first camp?
Yeah, I think so. Part of the reason, and this is why I put the emphasis on East Asia and China, I think there is something in East Asia in terms of historical evolution of state capacity which makes some of these things possible, which wouldn't be true in other parts of the world. So I'm not entirely sure how much you can emulate the Chinese model in Africa or Indian subcontinent or in Latin America. So that's the first question.
So, see, let me say something here. I resist this notion of state capacity the way that you use it.
Okay.
It sort of takes it as, kind of a predetermined, So I have no doubt with the, I have no dispute with the idea that some of it might be inherited and there might be,
Right.
path dependency, but I think for all the reasons you've emphasized that a lot of this can be shaped. I would say it's the same with state capacity.
Oh, absolutely. So I think
And
the
for
point of the
example,
Noro.
just to be clear about
Yes.
the East Asia. If you looked at South Korea in just in the aftermath of the Korean War, nobody would tell you that the Syngman Rhee regime had anything like state capacity whatsoever. In China, in the transition, sort of after Mao's death, again, you might have said that what led to the particular type of reforms was the weakness of the state capacity, their inability to control the economy in the way that Soviet Russia still could, that led to what was happening. So that's just a kind of dissent on the state capacity as something that is given as opposed to.
No, I definitely didn't mean to imply that. So thanks for emphasizing that and correcting that. In fact, again, I don't expect people to have read it, but the framework of the Narrow Corridor book that Jim Robinson and I have is about the evolution of state capacity. But our emphasis there is that in most cases, although there are very different paths, but in the most usual path, state capacity co-evolves with other institutions that involve society being able to control state capacity. And I think what's sort of different in East Asia, and I think that might have something to do with the Confucian bureaucratic history, is that the non-controlled state capacity has more of a presence. And even if in some periods it sort of collapses, and even in some periods it's used exactly for repression, or meaning that it's from society, not controlled by society. So not embedded in society, if you want to use that. Although people like Peter Evans use embedded autonomy for a different meaning. So I don't want to perhaps use the word embedded for that reason. So the sort of this top-down industrialization or top-down innovation is perhaps something that is feasible during certain episodes in East Asia and may not be that generalizable to other contexts. That's a question. I'm not saying that with certainty. But, for example, import substitution. It's been tried pretty much everywhere. And in many places it was a failure, and it was successful in East Asia. So again, there may be that the way that they did it was better, but I think the fact that it was
successful in Mexico, was in Brazil, and Colombia.
Well, in Brazil, Mexico, and in Colombia, it did lead to huge inefficiencies, which then led to the collapse of that same import substitution system, just like in Turkey.
It's another discussion.
That's another discussion. Okay.
Sorry, yeah, questions?
I'll try. So it seems to me that the argument suggests that all development opportunities and institutions submit, in a way, to the direction, to the dominant direction.
I think if you don't use that it's going to be better, because it's creating a lot of echo that I'm having.
Okay, so it seems this conversation seems to suggest that all development opportunities and institutions seem to submit to the dominant direction and pace technological change. So perhaps democracies fit the previous stage during industrialization, and it created platforms and situations for democracy to get stronger. So my question is, to what extent could our current shift towards authoritarian institutions be a function or a reaction to our current path of technological change?
Well, I would, that's a great question. And my take on it would be that it is a result of the particular type of power and economic inequalities that have emerged. In particular, it's no surprise to me that ideas about neo-monarchism and, sort of strong leaders that are unchecked by democratic sort of norms or institutions are very popular among the leaders that run the largest companies in the world. So that's the sense in which I think these things are related to economic things. But paradoxically, I would say, we need democracy even more today than during other periods. And the reason for that is you can get one glimpse of the argument for that from the way that Danny summarized, I think, what I was trying to articulate, but also I think it's probably common to Danny and Roberto as well, that, you know, if there is already an overlap between the skills of most of the workforce and the demand for labor from the most dynamical sectors, even without democracy, you're going to get some pressures for wage growth and development of a middle class. It won't be the same. Sometimes, you know, as in South Korea, before 1989, you'll have labor depression. But South Korean wages were growing even before democracy, when the industrialization was happening. Today, because we are at the cusp of going in a technological direction that will completely sideline labor, and because, if you believe my argument, again, Roberto and Danny also sort of are saying the same thing, that there is an alternative path that we can choose, democratic input, democratic pressure on technological choice and on the market structure are perhaps much more important today. And I would say that the way that we are at a point here where we have such powerful companies with both control over technology and dominance over their sectors is related to already nascent failures of democracy in the United States. So if democracy was stronger, we wouldn't, for example, completely have given up on antitrust and regulation and allowed a few companies to grow so big and so dominant.
I'll try this, it's okay? The microphone?
I think it's okay.
Okay, great. I was thinking regarding that point. Till what extent do you think that the deconfiguration of the labor market, in the sense that there's more precarization between the low and middle skilled workers that you identified, plays a role in the malleability of the path of technological change? In the sense that we not only don't have this match, but also these workers are facing another labor market situation, and there's no more social division of work, and like this current situation that we are facing now.
I think the current polarization in the labor market is, in my mind, an outcome of the technological choices that have been made over the last 40 years. Now, other social changes may interact with them in very different ways. So, you know, women and older workers are much more important today in the labor force, and they are not performing manual tasks for the most part. So there are comparative advantages in other types of jobs, and that's changing, of course, the type of profitable employment structure for companies, and it's interacting with technological changes. So I don't know whether that's what you had in mind with the social division of labor. Those things are, of course, influencing the employment structure, and they're influencing some of the technology choices. But there's a lot of richness there. But to me, it still comes to my version of what Roberto said about half an hour ago, which is that there is a direction of technology that's going to more and more eliminate the need for middle skill workers, low skill workers, from robotics and AI integrated with flexible robotics for manual repetitive tasks, for cognitive tasks in offices, and perhaps some of the more sort of judgment involved tasks, or I'm not entirely sure, and a more pro-worker direction which involves using these technologies to provide better information, more capabilities, more sophisticated tasks for workers, and that chasm is the most important one.
200.
Oh, okay.
I'm Lucas. I'm a college student. My question is only one. I'd like to ask you guys about developing technologies. You talked a little bit about DeepSeek most recently, trying to develop this app, say, and then it almost immediately dropped in value. A lot of NVIDIA stocks because they thought it would be cheaper and more efficient processors. This would be like an example of how competition between industries and companies actually works, like China's growth affecting directly US growth, but how do you guys see competition between institutions, in a sense, coming from a political economic standpoint?
By the way, I don't want to monopolize all the answers. If I were to say that, I don't think there's anything too much to read into the NVIDIA NVIDIA stock price falling in terms of a structural problem. I think it's, the US tech industry was all in to scale. The mantra was scale is all you need, and that's exactly what all of the companies were pursuing as a model, and that increased the demand for chips. And whether R1 from DeepSeek is generalizable, where it will go, etc., is unclear, but it was a shock to that model, and the big beneficiary of that was NVIDIA, so that leads to a big drop in its NVIDIA's price. So I think that's just usual economics. But in the background, there is a little bit of the last thing that you touched on, which is that companies are competing, different ecosystems for AI and AI direction are competing, and they are embedded in different institutions, so you can interpret that as different institutions competing. And that's the sense in which I said, I don't know the answer to whether the success of DeepSeek is replicable, and if it is, whether that will lead to a very distinct model of AI embedded in a very distinct set of Chinese institutions or not. We'll just have to see on that.
Let me just add one point on that. I think DeepSeek was also by undermining the tech model that was based almost exclusively on scale, the idea that you needed scale to lower costs. I think it opened up much greater institutional possibilities than was possible than would have been on the basis of scale. Because I think scale undermines the difficulties of having two critical elements that in the past, in terms of institutional landscape that we've had. One is countervailing power. So I think a lot of the concentration of economic power in the hands of tech is due to the power of scale, and it becomes much harder to establish countervailing power. The second is the need to have regulatory diversity, because we actually this multiplicity of ecosystems also goes along with a potential multiplicity of regulatory systems in terms of how does public policy, how does the government, how does civil society relate to the power of tech. And I think one of the things that we'll discuss is there's a lot of uncertainty about how to regulate. Even if we agree that tech ought to be regulated, there is not a single model of regulation. So there is inevitably a future counterpart to the models of varieties of capitalism and different models of regulation that we've had in the industrial age. And the possibility that maybe the scale effects are not so large, gives us the opportunity that maybe the loss in terms of efficiency that we would incur if we were to enable and allow regulatory multiplicity, and therefore multiplicity in ecosystems, that cost penalty or that penalty in terms of efficiency foregone is not as high as we thought it was going to be, because you can actually be highly efficient and productive, even in AI, at less than global scale. So I think it's very empowering. I found what DeepSeek has done very empowering in terms of our institutional possibilities as we go, both in terms of enabling greater scope for countervailing power and also setting us potentially on a path of regulatory diversity, where the US says, I'm going to do it this way, Europe says, I'm going to do it that way, China says, I'm going to do it this other way, and that these different firms, these different systems can be segmented to some extent without necessarily one becoming so much more efficient and productive that it necessarily would undermine those others. Does that, would you?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, the only wrinkle I would add to that, even though DeepSeek is using a very different approach and has definitely challenged the scale and the approaches, the groupthink, revealed the groupthink in the US industry, there is also some commonality in what DeepSeek is a company that is committed to AGI. They're trying to produce chatbots and reasoning models. So there are many, many other things, and it would have been even better if that frontier was also opened. But subject to that caveat.
Which we'll get back to. Yeah.
So I have a question about institutional change. You talked about how institutions aren't forever, but in politically stable and high-income countries, institutions tend to grow in one direction. They, government agencies get more powerful, markets get more mature, companies, tech companies get bigger and bigger. And I'm curious, in the same sort of vein, thinking about akin to sort of antitrust enforcement, maybe these companies don't have to be as big to be as productive as we want them to be. I'm curious what you think of the role and risk of creative destruction in institutional change. So thinking about this administration's goal to reshape the federal government, the end of Chevron doctrine, changes to domestic legal norms, to changes to global trade relations. What do you see as the risks and also the utility of blowing some stuff up?
So I think those are very wide-ranging questions, but I want to sort of distinguish two things. I think the fact that companies are getting bigger doesn't necessarily mean that institutions are failing. I think in the US context, it has meant so for two reasons. First of all, these companies that got too big became politically very powerful and socially very powerful. And second, the fact that they got so big was a failure of institutions, antitrust and regulation. But it is possible for different scales to coexist under functioning democratic institutions. For example, if you look at Sweden, it is actually an economy that has some very large firms, but these very large firms have generally remained quite constrained in their ability to influence policy, setting the political agenda, and even exercising their power in labor bargains, doing negotiations, etc. So it is possible for scale to coexist with better, more inclusive institutions, but once it reaches a certain size, it is going to create a lot of tensions. Now, I think independent of scale, but perhaps Roberto would say it is very much related to scale, there are many other aspects of Western society's institutions that seem much weaker today than they did 20 years ago. And I would point out one thing again for coming back to later. The most remarkable thing to me is that pretty much in every industrialized country, with a few exceptions, partial exceptions, the young generation, your generation, says they have very little trust in democracy, very little trust in public institutions, and they are much more willing to entertain alternatives to democracy, military rule, rule by experts, juntas, various different kinds of things. So there's something in the air, especially for the young generation, that I think spells very dangerous times.
I want to ask, I think we're running out of time, but I want to ask you sort of one final question. So imagine a future Daron Acemoglu 100 years ago, 100 years later, and he is trying to explain sort of which countries or regions did well on the basis of initial conditions in 2025. And he's convinced that institutional polity was the key differentiator. What indicator, whether it exists in quantitative form or not, do you think would be the best predictor 100 years later of which countries, regions, or cities will do better?
I don't think I can know that, because I think there is some element of looking back, and we tried to capture that a little bit in our work, for example, with critical junctures and the historically dependent nature of these things. But these institutions that I've mentioned as being so important would have amounted to nothing, and their influence would have been perhaps washed away by other things if it hadn't been for the Industrial Revolution. In fact, despite the big differences now that we see between Mexico and the United States in the 18th century, the income gap was trivial between the two. So it will depend on what are the technologies, how they work out, and what are the key institutional features that determine those institutional divergences. So if against every trend we are lucky and somehow we end up with a more pro-worker direction of AI, some of these things may not matter. If, on the other hand, we end up with a completely anti-worker direction, again, they may not matter. But I think my guess is that in 50 years' time, I don't know, 100, people will look at this period in the United States as a critical period, both for the US and the world, as where something really ruptured, unfortunately.
On that note, we have to end today's session, but we'll be back for more. And let's thank Daron especially for his presentation.
Thank you guys, my pleasure.
Can you scale the height without someone